Disturbing video footage has emerged from the University of Mississippi where some white students engage in heckling of a black woman. This going viral on social media over the weekend. Now, one student in that video footage appears to be making monkey gestures and noises directed at her. Let's take a look at that. The students who mocked the black pro-Palestinian protester, the one student has been expelled from his fraternity, Phi Delta Theta, per a statement from the fraternity released on Sunday. Now, the fraternity's actions do follow a student conduct investigation the university launched against at least one student. So we will stay tuned for any updates on that.
Amid these ongoing pro-Palestine protests, a new Economist YouGov poll found that 33% of Americans think colleges have not responded forcibly enough to the protests, while 16% believe the response has been too harsh. Now, when you break this down by age group, 48% of those 45 and older believe administrators haven't been harsh enough, compared to only 16% of people under 44. And as demonstrations persist, universities' commencement ceremonies have been disrupted, in some places canceled. Columbia University, the epicenter of protests, canceled its main campus ceremony. University of Southern California announced they plan to cancel, but are going to have a scaled back one instead. Other schools, including UNC Chapel Hill, George Washington University, to name a few, are going forward with ceremonies this coming weekend. So what do you make of this decision to cancel commencement altogether? I mean, I went to school at Brown, and it was almost expected that there was some protest that happens every commencement. Paxton, the university's president, is very controversial. There have been protests for divestment for a very long time at Brown. And so the ceremony still happens. People's points are made, but I think a lot of people look forward to this. Yes, it's silly to put on this hat and big robe, but I think it's a part of our culture. It's something we all appreciate. I think it's okay to say, yes, you worked so hard, you're getting this degree, everyone gets to put on their cap and gown and do the thing we like to do and have your commencement. And also some protests might happen, but it's almost, conceding to the protests. They're being incredibly disruptive if you cancel the whole ceremony. I don't know. I just think a few people shouting and with signs is fine to move forward with the commencement. It's almost like they want to do this and say, oh, you guys should be so mad at these protesters on campus who robbed you of your graduation. But it's really a decision coming from the administrators.
Yeah, I mean, I feel really bad for the students who were looking forward to this and having their commencements canceled. With the class of 2024, that was what, the high school graduating class of 2020 that had that interrupted by the pandemic. So this class specifically, this year of people have gotten some really bad luck, and I do feel bad for them, and I think it's utterly ridiculous to cancel. I mean, so the pomp and ceremony of these things is itself somewhat ridiculous. It's impossible, or it's difficult, I think, to pick a politically neutral person who is interesting enough or intriguing enough to be worthy of speaking, or who's not going to make bland remarks. And then if they're not politically neutral, they're always going to make someone upset. So, and then that's fine. And then there can be a little bit of protesting, and it just goes on, it goes forth. I think educational institutions in particular have gotten really, because of COVID, they're very inclined to shut things down easily when they don't need to. I'm hearing, we see a lot more news reports now of like K through 12 schools shutting down, not just for like a snow day, but for any old reason. And I think that's a bad trajectory, particularly for K through 12, particularly for less elite educational institutions, really, where those kids, if they're not in school, they're going to have like markedly worse social outcomes and professional outcomes, and crime is more likely, and wayward behavior is more likely. For the elite kids, whatever, they don't get to have their little fancy party with a speech. I guess it's not the big deal, but if I was one of them, I would be upset at this, because you're right, there's no reason they can't do it anyway. Maybe they're trying to make the protesters seem unpopular. Frankly, I think, based on some of that polling we read. So my read on the protests is that they are pretty unpopular. I was reflecting on this over the weekend, so I want to get your take on this, comparing the media, the mainstream media, the liberal media, progressive media, coverage of the pro-Palestine protests on campus compared to, say, the Black Lives Matter protests from a couple years ago. I think the coverage of the Black Lives Matter protests from the mainstream media was pretty positive. I mean, they were mocked, frankly, by conservatives for when there were literal buildings on fire, and CNN's like, everything's fine, look at how important and transformative this is. Compare that to this coverage, which has been, in my view, neutral, if not hostile, if not negative, toward what's going on campuses. I think in some cases, even unfairly so, to be honest, cards on the table. So I don't know what to make of that, other than the media this time, for whatever reason, does not want to be shown to be in sympathy with these protesters. Maybe because that makes Joe Biden look bad then, and they're paranoid about causing Trump to get elected instead. That's my guess, but it's just a hunch. What do you think?
I think the mainstream American media will be as critical as they can be that the American conscience and public will allow. And I think we've already had major reckonings around civil rights, around the racial divide in the country. I think most people during the Black Lives Matter protests were pretty sympathetic after seeing the body-worn camera footage and all of the footage of shootings of unarmed Black men by the police and women that led to the uprising in 2020. And so I think it was almost like they didn't have a choice, that if they were being critical of the protesters, it wouldn't land with the American people. And we've already had a major civil rights movement. We've already decided that Martin Luther King Jr., who's very unpopular during his time alive and active in the U.S., that now he's actually a great guy. And so we've already gone through that reckoning, and it took far too long. But I think most people are at a place where they feel very differently about race, about Black Americans and the divide between, Black America and the rest of the country. I think they're already at a place where they're very critical of our history there and critical of racism in general and when it shows up in our society. But I don't think the American political conscience has a strong grasp on what the apartheid is like for Palestinians and what the occupation has been like by Israel and Palestine. It's almost more of something you can draw parallel to the U.S.'s support of the apartheid regime in South Africa, and how it took over 10 years for the United Nations to condemn the apartheid in South Africa, for the U.S. to come out and condemn the apartheid in South Africa. And so we really lag behind when it comes to international politics as a public. And I think a big part of that is because we don't teach, the real history of American imperialism and what foreign policy has been for the United States over the past 30 years. So of course it's not going to be a part of the American conscience. That's no fault of them, but the media really takes advantage of that, because a lot of the people making decisions for these media companies and the owners of them are people who are either directly or indirectly profiting off of U.S. imperialism. And in any case, whether you want to say we're involved in imperialism in Israel or not, I would say we are, because Israel's occupying Palestine and we've been giving them billions of dollars for many years. But I think even if you just look at who has dollars invested in America's biggest military contractors and how lobbying tends to tell members of Congress, yes, give tons of money to the Department of Defense. There are a lot of people that have a say in media that are stenographers at this point of the U.S. military-industrial complex. And so that's really where I see the divide. I think there's more parallels to like apartheid South Africa and Vietnam protests than the Black Lives Matter protests here.
I mean, the Vietnam protests, they were protesting, the Americans, right, on the young Americans being drafted against their will, being sent to die in this country halfway across the globe for political reasons that I think the American people became increasingly skeptical of, that this was necessary, that this was in the country's best interests. Now, of course, those protests sometimes involving violence and property destruction, and then Richard Nixon goes on to win the 1968 election on a law and order platform, on a return to normalcy platform, a Republican. I think there are some parallels to that because, as we looked at those poll numbers, there are a lot of Americans who watched those campus protests, the ones we just had, the ones that are still ongoing, and said, yeah, I think the police ought to have done more. I think the crackdown should have been stronger. I think, independent of the cause that these protesters support, they think their antics, they think their behavior, they don't agree with it, they don't like it, they don't appreciate it. I think to some degree it's independent of the cause itself. So I wonder if the protesters are doing the cause any good, and frankly, if they're making what I'm sure many on the left would consider to be authoritarianism or law and order type politics more appealing in this moment of time. So I think they might very well backfire in the short and maybe even long term.
I don't think so. I think they've just successfully gotten the attention of national media, and they've had more people realize, okay, the youth are very critical of the U.S.'s position in Israel. I think it's been very powerful to see them willing to camp out, to make their voices heard by the administrators. We've had schools already start divesting from any companies that are profiting off of Israel's occupation of Palestine and operating in Israel. And so I think just because schools are divesting some of their endowments, from these major companies, that's huge. That's a huge win for students. And so their demands are being met. So, by any sense of the word successful, when your demands are met, that's a successful protest. Power concedes nothing without a demand, never has, never will. And to make, the powers that be uncomfortable. In some cases, it's, university administrators, and they decide to divest. In some cases, it's the board that's making those decisions about how the endowment's invested. But you also have people like Tom Cotton that are very pissed off about these protesters. When you're getting the attention of members of Congress, that's a very successful protest. And I think this is, it's interesting because people were being drafted in Vietnam. We don't have that here. It's a little bit impersonal in the sense that people aren't having their lives ultimately put on the line for a war they disagree with. But it is personal in the sense that we're getting videos on our social media feeds directly from the people in Gaza, seeing the impact of what American-made and American-purchased weapons, what the impact is for a lot of innocent civilians. We get to see the destruction and the towns leveled. And so it's almost laughable when we think about windows getting broken on campus and we see hospitals leveled. We see entire towns just turned into rubble and ash. And so it really makes it comedic that, these people largely over 45 years old are upset that there's some kind of property damage here. I don't think these folks are really seeing the footage in the way that young people are. They're not on social media if you're over the age of 45. And so I think if they were seeing the images of what life is like in Gaza today in the way that young people are, I think they would be less critical of the protesters and their decision to mostly peacefully protest on their college campuses.
We should talk about the clip we played right at the top of the segment briefly. I will say I'm always a little bit hesitant to weigh in on a short video clip I saw on social media, even if it looks really bad, and pass some kind of judgment on it, because I was, very involved in the footage of the kids at the Covington students at the Lincoln Memorial several years ago, where every media outlet came in and swiftly condemned them and accused them of racism and all these other things, when the young man who was seen to have this confrontation with a Native American, supposedly peace protester there. And then what happened is you saw the extended video footage and that the situation had been totally misrepresented, and that the kids, and particularly that kid, had not really done anything wrong. So I always have that in the back of my head as we approach things like this. The quick reaction, it takes sober investigation to know exactly what's going on. So I think the fraternity has looked into it and they concluded that it was indeed bad, and it looks bad. So obviously, treating people in a derogatory and racist way is extremely bad and should not take place.
Yeah, the energy of that group of guys. I mean, we don't talk about this a lot in media. We really like to rely on concrete facts. We want to see that he said something racist, that there was negative intent. But I mean, just watching that video, human beings understand other people's vibe, other people's energy. It had bad energy, that group of guys at Olemiss, just plain and simple. It didn't seem like they were out there because they genuinely cared about a cause and wanted their voices heard politically. It seemed that they were out there just to be counter protesters because they felt uncomfortable that people were expressing their voices on their campus. I really would love to interview every single one of those boys in that video and ask them why they were out there, how they feel about, the Israel-Palestine war, how they feel about Hamas, what they think of the IDF and the funding going towards Israel, because it really just didn't have the energy of we're here to have our voices heard. They really seemed extremely chaotic, extremely negative and bad energy, and just unnecessary gestures towards someone who was speaking at this protest. And so, yeah, I have seen photos of him circulate social media, the one that was making monkey noises to the right of the camera in that shot. And, the response has mostly been, let's make him famous, let's blow up his spot. And that's what happens in the age of social media. Just one mistake that a young kid makes. Who knows if he's, had a chance to learn about these things, if he went to public school before this and, isn't fully aware of the political extent to what he was showing up as a counter protester, for. And so now he might be famous for making monkey noises at this person. It has consequences. But again, this is a young person without their judgment center of their brain fully developed. So I do get worried about lives being ruined, when people could, be talked to and come over to our side or reach a more reasonable position politically.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. It's, the kind of mob social media tribunal, I think often overcorrects for something that might be legitimately bad, but like what should it be a death sentence? Should you be permanently unemployable? Should you be expelled? Should you have, your entire rest of your life ruined, this always haunting you, always following you around? There's so many examples of this on all sides, the kind of unpersoning, the canceling that takes place. Again, sometimes in response to something that was, okay, that was bad, but when you were young, well, you're still young, but when I was young and there was no social media and there was no smartphones, people, young people get into trouble. They say stupid things and it wasn't recorded and it wasn't preserved, didn't exist for all time to ruin your life. So, not trying to detract from people need to, show responsibility and be responsible. But I think in our modern and social media era, our responses are often not well calibrated, or in fact, it's impossible to calibrate correctly to things like this because you can't rein in the online mob. We will continue to discuss this subject, more Rising, right after this.